Have you ever felt that shiver down your spine when walking in a deserted place where the silence seems to scream? Now imagine being alone, in the middle of the night, responding to a distress call that no one else heard. This is the story of Diego, a police officer who found himself face to face with something that not even years on patrol prepared him to face. In this disturbing narrative, we delve into the dark secrets of an abandoned house, where the past never rests. And remember, real fear doesn't always come to rest, comes from those who are alive, are ready to face, so stay until the end because this story will give you goosebumps. First story, The Night Watch and Whispers in the Dark. Diego was used to the silence of nights on patrol. The radio was usually his only company, with occasional crackles and routine calls. But that night, there was something different in the air. The sky was heavy, covered in dark clouds, and the wind cut through the air like a grim warning. It was almost midnight, and Diego was parked on a deserted road, reviewing reports when the radio made a strange static sound. He frowned. It was no ordinary sound. Soon a voice appeared on the other side, almost a whisper. "Officer, please come. House at 13 Willow Road. Something is wrong. Please." Diego sat up straighter, his heart beating faster. The voice sounded scared, almost desperate. He tried to respond over the radio, but only received silence in response. The request did not register as an official call, and the address was not in the reports that night. Still, there was something about that request that he couldn't ignore. Something in the tone of the voice, a mix of fear and urgency, that made him feel like he needed to investigate. Turning on his cruiser's lights, Diego drove toward Willow Road. The road was narrow, lined with trees that seemed to bend inwards, as if they wanted to swallow whoever passed by. The darkness was dense, and the only light came from the vehicle's headlights, which illuminated the path unevenly due to the fog that was beginning to form. As he drove, Diego felt something he couldn't explain, a shiver running down his spine. The air felt colder than usual, and he noticed that even the natural sounds of the night were absent. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of the engine and the pulse of your racing heart. After about 15 minutes, he spotted the weathered sign indicating the entrance to Willow Road. The number 13 was painted on an old rusty iron gate, which creaked slowly as it was pushed. Behind the gate, he saw the house. It was large but completely desolate, with broken windows and peeling paint. The surrounding trees seemed darker here, casting shadows that seemed to move in the light of the moon, which had briefly appeared through the clouds. Diego parked the car and got out. The wind grew stronger, almost carrying the sound of whispers. He looked around, but saw no one. The house looked abandoned for years. However, he felt that nagging feeling that he was being watched. As he climbed the wooden steps that creaked under his weight, the sound echoed like a muffled scream in the silence of the night. He knocked on the door, but it slowly opened at the touch. Inside, the house was cold and dark, and the smell of mold and rotting wood was almost unbearable. With his flashlight in hand, he began to explore. "Police! Did someone call for help?" His voice echoed off the empty walls, but all he heard was the sound of something scratching the floor upstairs. He stopped, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. It didn't sound like a mouse or something small. It was heavy, dragging, as if something or someone was moving slowly. "If anyone is there, show yourself now," he ordered, but the only response was the muffled sound of footsteps upstairs. Diego took a deep breath and climbed the stairs, which seemed to protest with every step. Upon reaching the top, he saw a long corridor with doors on both sides. The shuffling had stopped, but the silence was even more disturbing. Then he saw something. At the end of the hallway, a faint light coming from one of the half-open doors. Cautiously, Diego walked towards the light, holding tight to his flashlight and his hand near the gun on his belt. Pushing the door open, he entered an empty room, except for an old rocking chair in the center, which was slowly rocking, although the air was still. On the chair was an old radio, similar to the one used by the police decades ago. And then he heard it again. That same voice that had asked for help, now clearer but filled with something sinister. "You came, but can you leave?" Diego froze, his blood running cold in his veins. The chair stopped rocking, and the door behind him closed with a bang, and so began the night that Diego would never forget. Diego was unable to leave the room immediately. For a few seconds, he stood still, staring at the door that had closed by itself. His breathing was heavy, and his heart felt like a drum beating in his chest. He knew he couldn't let fear rule him, but something in that house played with his mind, something that seemed alive, watching his every move. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. That didn't make sense. He didn't hear any key turn, no mechanism lock, but the doorknob wouldn't move. The old radio on the chair was still there, silent, as if mocking its presence. He forced himself to look around the room again, looking for some way out or explanation. In the corner, he noticed a crack in the wall. It wasn't big, but it looked recent, as if the house was slowly falling apart, or maybe shaping up. Suddenly, the radio emitted a loud static noise, breaking the silence. Diego backed away, instinctively pointing the flashlight at the device. Then the voice came again, but this time it was different, deeper, more drawn out. "You have found the beginning, but there is more to see. Go to the end of the street. The answer is there." The radio turned off, and the door, as if by magic, unlocked itself. Diego didn't hesitate. He opened the door and walked out, feeling as if the air in the hallway was heavier, almost suffocating. The same dragging as before returned, but now it seemed to come from several directions at once. He went down the stairs in a hurry. With each step, he heard the echo of footsteps that weren't his. When he reached the front door, it was open, as if the house was kicking him out. Outside, the air felt different. The night was colder, and the fog was now so thick that he could barely see the car parked a few meters away. The voice echoed in his head, "Go to the end of the street." Diego thought about ignoring that. The house had already shown enough for him to want to leave and never return. But something pulled him to continue, a morbid curiosity, a need to understand what was happening. He got into the cruiser, started the engine, but hesitated for a moment, watching the house in the rearview mirror. It was as if she were looking at him, an almost living presence in the darkness. He shook his head, trying to shake the thought away, and drove slowly down Willow Road. As I advanced, the road seemed to change. The trees seemed more crooked, the branches like hands trying to grab him. The light from the headlights reflected off something on the asphalt, but it always disappeared as he approached. It was as if the road was playing with him, prolonging his journey. Diego checked the clock on the dashboard. midnight. It felt like he had been driving for hours, but the clock had barely moved. Then he saw it. At the end of the road, a house appeared in the fog. It was smaller than the first, but equally dark. The windows were black holes that seemed to watch him, and the roof was partially collapsed, as if time had been especially cruel to her. But what caught his attention most was the dim light of a lantern swinging from the porch, illuminating a figure standing there. Diego parked the car, swallowing hard. He got out and approached cautiously. The figure did not move, and as he got closer, he saw that it was an elderly man with pale skin and worn clothes. His eyes were fixed on Diego, but they seemed empty, lifeless. Before Diego could say anything, the man pointed to the door of the house and whispered, "You came this far. Now come in if you dare." Diego hesitated, but knew he had no choice. Something inside him drove him, a mix of fear and need. He climbed the steps, which were damp and slippery, and opened the door. The interior was completely dark. except for a faint flame in a fireplace. He heard the sound of footsteps behind him and turned around, but the old man had already disappeared, as if he had never been there. Inside the house, the smell was different from before, something metallic and strange, almost like blood. The silence was overwhelming, and the only thing Diego could hear was the sound of his own breathing. However, with every step he took, he felt as if he was entering deeper into something that was not meant to be discovered. A faint sound began to echo, like distant crying coming from somewhere in the house. And at that moment, Diego realized the end of the street was not the destination. It was the beginning of the real nightmare. Diego entered the house with cautious steps. Everything there seemed stuck in time, as if no one had walked through the door in decades. The curtains were dense cobwebs, the floorboards creaked with every movement, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. The metallic smell, which he had noticed before, seemed even stronger in here, mixed with something sweet and rotten. He found himself in a small living room, dimly lit by the firelight, where a weak flame struggled to stay alive. There was a wooden table in the center, covered in a layer of dust so thick that Diego could write on it with his finger. Next to the table, a small piece of furniture with drawers caught his attention. Something about him seemed off. The drawers were closed, but the furniture seemed to vibrate slightly, as if there was something alive inside. Diego approached, slowly, his flashlight illuminating the furniture. He grabbed the handle of the first drawer and pulled it. It was empty. He opened the second one, also nothing. On the third, however, he found something that made his stomach turn. There was a diary bound in old leather with dark stains that he chose not to investigate. Diego felt a twinge of hesitation, but knew he needed to continue. He picked up the journal, noting that it was cold to the touch, almost like ice. When he opened the cover, the first page was written in a fine, almost elegant handwriting. This diary belongs to Agnes Hawthorne. If you found this, pray for her soul. Diego frowned. The name was unfamiliar to him, but something about the warning seemed filled with desperation. He turned the page. The first entries were routine, almost banal, reports of a couple who had moved into the house at the end of the street. They were happy, at least in the beginning. Agnes wrote about the renovations to the house, the garden she wanted to plant, and the dream of raising a family there. But as Diego continued reading, the words began to change tone. The sentences became shorter, more erratic, with scribbles and stains that seemed to be from tears, or something more sinister. "He is not alone," read one entry. "I hear voices at night. They come from the basement. They talk about things I shouldn't hear." Another entry, written in barely legible handwriting, said, "My husband has changed. He doesn't talk to me anymore. He just stands on the porch, staring into space. I think he's hearing the voices too." Diego felt a shiver run up his spine. The diary seemed to pulse in his hands, as if it were part of something alive. The last pages were filled with grotesque drawings, human figures with black eyes and mouths open in silent screams. He turned another page, and something fell to the floor. A small, rusty key with a piece of black ribbon tied to the top. As he bent down to retrieve the key, the fireplace went out on its own, plunging the house into oppressive darkness. Diego quickly turned on the flashlight, his heart pounding in his chest, so he listened. It was a faint sound, like footsteps coming from above. The upstairs was empty, he was sure of it. But the footsteps were unmistakable. Diego looked at the diary again, where the words on the last page seemed to jump off the pages. "Don't open the door. By God, don't open the door." He clutched the key in his hand and looked up at the stairs, leading to the upper floor. The footsteps were louder now, closer. Diego knew that the choice was before him. Go up the stairs and face what awaited him, or leave that house while he still could. But something inside him, Perhaps curiosity, perhaps the feeling that he was at a point of no return, compelled him to climb. Each step creaked loudly in the silence, and the sound of footsteps ceased as soon as he reached the top. There was a narrow hallway with several doors, but one of them was ajar. The dim light of the flashlight revealed only a shadow on the ground, but it was enough to make Diego's blood run cold. The key seemed to weigh heavier in his hand as he approached the door. He could feel the energy in the air, as if something was waiting for him on the other side. When he finally reached the door, Diego's breathing was so loud it was almost a scream. He looked at the lock, where the key seemed to fit perfectly. Diego hesitated for a moment, remembering the words from the diary. But before he could decide, the door opened on its own with a long, terrifying groan, and inside, the truth about Agnes Hawthorne and the house began to reveal itself. The door slowly opened, revealing a small, almost empty room. The walls were covered in worn wallpaper, and the only furniture was a rocking chair in the center of the room. She was facing the window, swaying alone. Although there was no wind or any visible movement in the air, Diego's flashlight shook in his hand as he tried to illuminate every corner of the space, but it seemed like the light couldn't completely penetrate the shadows that dominated the room. On the floor, next to the chair, was an antique doll. His clothes were dingy white, and his glass eyes seemed to follow Diego as he took slow steps into the room. Something about that doll felt deeply wrong, but he knew the sensation came from something else, from a presence he could feel but not see. The sound of the rocking chair suddenly stopped, leaving the room in absolute silence. Diego held his breath, listening for any sign of movement. It was then that he realized he was no longer alone. A long shadow began to form on the opposite wall, even without a clear source of light. It seemed to lengthen and take shape, as if something was rising from the ground. Diego froze, unable to look away, as the shadow took the silhouette of a tall human figure with disproportionately long arms that almost touched the ground. The figure's face was indistinct, but the eyes were two empty sockets that seemed to devour the light. The figure took a step forward, and the floor creaked under the weight of something that shouldn't be there. Diego tried to step back, but he felt the cold of the wall against his back. The shadow advanced slowly, each movement filling the air with an almost unbearable tension. When the figure finally stopped, just a few steps away, a low, guttural voice echoed through the room. But it wasn't coming from the shadow. She seemed to be inside Diego's own head. "You shouldn't be here," the voice whispered. "But now, you're part of the house." Diego tried to scream, but no sound came out. He felt a tightness in his throat, as if the shadow was sucking in the air around him. Desperately, he remembered the key in his hand and held it tightly, as if it were an amulet against evil. The diary had talked about not opening the door, but the key seemed to be his only defense. Gathering his courage, he held the key before him, waiting for the figure to retreat. Instead, the shadow tilted its head, as if curious, and then pointed to something behind Diego. Slowly, he turned around and saw another door in the corner of the room. She wasn't there before. The new door was unlike any he had ever seen. Made of dark, cracked wood, it had carved symbols that seemed to pulse slightly, as if they were alive. Diego felt the cold increase as he approached, his hands shaking as he fit the key into the lock. The shadow remained motionless, watching him like a predator watching its prey. With a loud click, the lock opened. The door creaked as it was pushed open, revealing a staircase that descended into absolute darkness. The metallic smell he had smelled before was now unbearable, and the air was heavy, as if time itself had stopped. "Get down," the guttural voice ordered, now clearer and more insistent. Diego hesitated. Everything in his body screamed for him to run, but something was pulling him towards the stairs. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was the same instinct that had led him to this cursed house. But before he could make a decision, the shadow pushed him hard, and he fell down the steps, plunging into darkness. The staircase seemed endless, and the sound of his fall echoed around him as if he were falling into an abyss. When he finally stopped, he found himself in a large, cavernous cellar, lit by a dim, reddish light that seemed to emanate from the floor. In the center of the space, there was a circle of symbols, the same ones he had seen on the door, and in the middle of the circle, something was waiting for him. Diego barely had time to process what he saw before he realized that the shadow had descended with him, now hovering over the circle. "Welcome to the true heart of the house," the voice said as the room began to shake. And it was there, in that forgotten basement, that Diego realized that the house didn't just want to scare him. She wanted to devour him. Diego was trapped in the basement, the air filled with the smell of rust and something darker, almost alive. In the center of the circle of symbols, he saw the impossible, a body, or what was left of one. The skin was dry as paper, but the eyes, still open, glowed with an unsettling red light. When the corpse's mouth moved, whispering words Diego couldn't understand, the truth hit him like an avalanche. The house was not just a building. It was a vessel, a hungry entity that fed on souls. Each resident, each visitor left something behind, and Diego, by turning the key and opening the door, had activated the cycle once again. He was now part of it. A laugh echoed, but it wasn't human. It came from the walls, the floor, even the air. And then he saw it. The surrounding shadows turned into faces, pale, disfigured, desperate. Former residents, each trapped in darkness, unable to escape. Diego felt his body freeze as he realized he was destined for the same fate. But before the horror could completely consume him, the guttural voice spoke one last time, now clear and full of perverse pleasure. "You discovered the truth, but will anyone out there have the courage to listen?" Suddenly everything went dark. The darkness, the house, the faces. And Diego was found days later sitting on the porch, unable to speak. He just held the diary in his hands, frantically scribbling a message that no one could decipher. Stories like this make us question. What? Do we really know about the places we choose to call home? Do some houses hold secrets that should remain buried? If you got stuck in this narrative, imagine what's yet to come in the next videos. So don't waste time. Subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell so you don't miss any new stories, and leave your like. Every click helps bring you more terrifying mysteries like this one. And remember, the next time you enter a new house, pay attention. Some doors should never be opened. Let's go to the second story. The Silent Patrol, the mystery of the last car. Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when you hear something strange in the stillness of the night? Imagine being a veteran, police officer, investigating the disappearance of a police car, only to discover that the road holds a terrifying secret. In this disturbing true story, you will be immersed in a mystery that defies logic, full of sinister clues, dark presences, and an ending that will leave you with goosebumps. If you like stories that keep you hooked from start to finish, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and come with me to unravel this scary case. The night was dense, shrouded in thick fog that transformed the streets into corridors of mystery and silence. The police station, almost empty on that night shift, was lit only by the cold lights of computers and the occasional sound of the telephone echoing through the hallway. For Officer Miguel, it was just another ordinary night until the police radio began to crackle with unusual interference. Car 302, respond. Car 302, are you listening? The voice of Laura, the switchboard operator, was firm, but carried a hint of concern. Miguel, sitting next to the radio, frowned. He knew that 302 was on duty, on a routine patrol on a quiet road. There was no reason for the sudden silence. He grabbed the radio microphone and tried to make direct contact. Car 302, this is the base. Any problems? Answer. Only static returned. Miguel felt a chill down his spine that wasn't caused by the police station's broken air conditioning. Something was wrong. He knew that. Laura entered the room, holding a sheet of patrol details. They were on Estrada de Vale, close to kilometer 12, but they disappeared from the radar about 20 minutes ago. I thought it was a signal problem, but I tried more than once. Nothing. The Vale Road was known for its deserted length and for stories that residents told in hushed voices. Ancient disappearances, strange lights in the sky, and a silence that seemed to swallow any human sound. Miguel was not superstitious, but the story made something stir in his mind. He looked at Laura, who, despite being practical and always skeptical, had slightly wide eyes. "I'll go check it out," said Miguel, getting up quickly. He grabbed the car keys and a flashlight, trying to stifle the tightness in his chest that was beginning to grow. Laura looked at him hesitantly, but didn't try to stop him. "Keep me posted," was all he said, as Miguel drove down the dark. The sound of tires on asphalt seemed to echo more than usual. The radio on the dashboard was still playing static, but he insisted on calling patrol car 302. 302, this is Officer Miguel. Reply. Are you guys okay? Nothing. Just the subtle sound of static that seemed to whisper something he couldn't understand. The surrounding landscape seemed increasingly oppressive. Huge trees leaned over the road as if they were watching the police car pass by. The fog was so thick that the light from the headlights could barely pierce the darkness ahead. When Miguel passed kilometer 10, he felt the first real chill of the night, an unmistakable feeling that he was being watched. He glanced at the rear view. Mirrors, but all he saw was pitch-black emptiness. As he approached kilometer 12, he saw something in the distance, the flashing lights of police car 302. The feeling of relief was instantaneous, but quickly replaced by a growing uneasiness. Why weren't the agents responding? He stopped a few meters from the vehicle, parked on the side of the road, turned on the high beams, and got out of the car with the flashlight in hand. The silence there was absolute, overwhelming. No sound of crickets, no breeze rustling the leaves. Just the sound of his own footsteps echoing off the asphalt like a rhythmic beat that seemed to get louder and louder in his mind. The vehicle was empty. The doors are unlocked. The radio is on, but not a soul is in sight. Miguel illuminated the interior of the car with the flashlight. The seats were overturned, as if someone had left in a hurry. On the floor, there was a notebook with notes from the agents. Quiet patrol. Nothing to report. Until now. The last sentence was written with visible haste, and the ink seemed to have been smudged by a drop of water, or perhaps something else. It was then that he heard it, a distant sound coming from the forest beside the road. It was a low whisper, almost imperceptible, but it made your hair stand on end. He turned the flashlight toward the dense bushes and walked hesitantly, each step seeming more difficult than the last. The unanswered call now seemed to echo in his own mind, as if the silence had a presence. And then, right on the edge between the road and the shadows of the forest, Miguel saw something that made his heart stop for a moment. Footprints, fresh, heading towards the unknown. Miguel stood still, staring at the footprints that disappeared into the darkness of the forest. The flashlight shook slightly in his hands, and he took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of thoughts that invaded him. He knew the stories about the Vale Road, or as the old-timers called it, the Wailing Road. Each tale seemed more absurd than the last. Screams in the early hours of the morning, visions of distorted figures, and, most disturbingly, unexplained disappearances. Determined to find the missing agents, Miguel followed the footprints. The sound of the forest seemed amplified. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like a scream in the oppressive silence. The feeling of being watched grew with each step, as if invisible eyes were following him. The trail took him to a small path that wound through the trees, covered in thick fog. Miguel shined a light on the ground, noticing that the footprints were becoming more spaced and irregular, as if whoever had made them was running or staggering. He stopped when he heard a distinct sound. It wasn't the rustling of the wind or the sounds of the forest. It was a lament. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, a distorted melody filled with pain and despair. Miguel froze for a moment, trying to identify the source, but it was impossible. He picked up the radio on his shoulder and tried one more time. "Laura, this is Miguel. I'm in the forest following a trail. Footprints lead inside. I'm hearing something strange. If you can hear me, send reinforcements." The answer came immediately, but not as he expected. From the radio came the same sound that echoed in the forest, a low, agonizing wail, like a choir of mixed voices. Miguel reflexively put down the radio, feeling his heart race. When he took it back, the sound had stopped. He continued walking, feeling the ground slope downwards. The forest seemed to close in around them, the branches forming arches that further obscured the moonlight. Then he saw it. In the middle of a clearing, there was an old car, covered in moss and rust. It looked like it had been there for decades, a forgotten monument to times gone by. Miguel approached, illuminating the bodywork, and noticed that the doors were locked. On the driver's seat, there was something strange. A police uniform, torn and faded, with dark stains that he preferred not to identify. Miguel tried to open the door, but it was stuck. He took a step back, feeling the weight of the air around him increase. It was then that he saw shadows moving at the edges of the clearing. They had no definite shape, but there was something deeply human in their contours, something that chilled his blood. The figures seemed to watch him, motionless, but charged with an energy that bordered on hostile. He tried to back away, but when he shone the flashlight at them, they disappeared. The wail returned, now louder, closer. Miguel knew he needed to get out of there, but something compelled him to continue. On the side of the car, he found a symbol etched into the rust. It was a circle with lines running through it, something he didn't recognize, but felt strangely familiar. He took a photo with his cell phone, which took all the courage he had, and started back along the trail. But as he walked, he noticed that the path had changed. The forest now seemed endless, with trees he didn't remember ever crossing before. The wails intensified, echoing in his mind like distant screams, and the feeling of being followed became unbearable. Miguel ran, guided only by his flashlight and the hope of escaping that place. But deep down, he knew there was something on the wailing road that didn't want to let him go. Something that had waited a long time for someone like him. Miguel left the forest with his heart racing, but he barely had time to process what had happened. His radio finally worked again, although static still persisted in parts. He got into the police car, started the engine and hit the road, eager to return to the police station and report everything he had seen. The night seemed colder, and the loneliness of the deserted road was suffocating. As he drove, he looked in the rearview mirror and froze. There was someone in the back seat. Miguel felt a chill run down his spine. He turned his head slowly, but the bench was empty. Trying to remain calm, he adjusted the mirror again. This time he didn't see anyone, but the feeling of not being alone accompanied him. The radio chirped again, and a familiar voice echoed through it. "Help me." The voice was weak, almost indistinct, but Miguel recognized it immediately. It was Laura, his partner. "Laura, where are you?" he shouted into the radio, but the static returned. Suddenly, the radio turned off by itself, and the vehicle's interior lights began to flash. Miguel parked on the shoulder, trying to understand what was happening. He got out of the car to check if there was a problem with the electrical system. It was then that he saw her. A female figure stood on the side of the road, shrouded in an almost ethereal mist. Her long, wet hair fell over her face, and she wore what looked like a police uniform, although it was torn and stained. Miguel recognized the face immediately. It was Laura. "Laura!" he shouted, running towards you. But as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The figure did not move like a normal person. His feet weren't touching the ground, and his eyes were empty, shining with a cold, bluish light. She raised her hand, pointing to the back seat of the squad car. Miguel looked back hesitantly and saw something that took his breath away. A spectral-looking man sitting in the back seat, staring at him with deep-set eyes and a macabre smile. The man wore an old police uniform with an illegible badge and burn marks on his body. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the wail that Miguel had heard in the forest echoed around him again. The ghost police officer pointed to the front of the road, and at that moment, Miguel understood that he needed to keep driving. He got into the car, sweating cold, and accelerated. Laura's figure disappeared into the fog, but the ghost passenger remained in the back seat. Miguel tried to ignore him, focusing only on the road. But as he drove, the surrounding landscape began to change. The road seemed older, the trees taller and more sinister. He realized he was driving along a distorted and desolate version of the Wailing Road. The ghost passenger pointed again, this time to a specific spot on the road. Miguel followed the direction indicated, feeling the weight of fear increase. He knew he was heading towards something, but he had no choice. When he reached his destination, a dilapidated hut appeared on the side of the road. Miguel stopped the car, and the ghost disappeared. The cabin door was ajar, and a burning smell was coming from it. He grabbed his flashlight, took a deep breath, and went inside. The interior was filled with old objects, burned police files, melted dog tags, and newspaper clippings. On one of the walls, Miguel saw photos of missing agents, including Laura. In the center of the room, there was a table with an open diary, where a message seemed to have just been written. You now know the price. Save them, or become one. Miguel felt an icy wind pass by him, and the lights of his flashlight flickered. He knew something was still there, waiting for his choice. The cabin was immersed in a dense, almost palpable silence, and the smell of burning permeated the air. Miguel hesitated before touching the diary that was open on the table. The handwritten words were crooked, as if the author had trembled while writing them. Each page seemed to scream a story of pain and terror. Day 1. The cabin is small, but it has everything I need. I was transferred to this rural patrol. Apparently it is a quiet area. Nothing happens here. Miguel flipped through the pages, each one recording a gradual change. The diary belonged to an agent named Ernesto, whose name was on the list of missing persons found at the police station. As Miguel read, he realized that Ernesto was documenting something terrible. Day 15. I started hearing things at night. Sounds of footsteps, voices whispering my name. I thought it was tiredness, but today I saw marks in the ground around the cabin. They are not from any animal that I know of. Miguel felt a shiver run down his spine. He turned the page, and the writing became more irregular, as if Ernesto was desperate. Day 23. Yesterday, I saw something in the woods. He wasn't human, but he watched me. His eyes glowed in the dark, and his footsteps made no sound. No, I'm here. I think I'm next. A low noise echoed through the cabin, interrupting Miguel's reading. He swung the flashlight toward the sound, but saw nothing but motionless shadows. The wind outside seemed stronger, as if it were surrounding the cabin. He returned to his diary, his hands now shaking. On the penultimate page, the tone of the words changed completely. Day 30. The door won't stop opening on its own, even if I lock it. They want me to leave. Today I found a body on the road. I don't know how he got there, but he wears a police uniform. I am no longer alone in this curse. Miguel started to turn to the last page, but stopped when he noticed something strange. The diary felt thicker than it should have. He ran his fingers along the back cover and found a hidden pocket. Inside it, there was a photo. The image was blurry, but it showed a group of smiling police officers next to a patrol car. In the corner was Laura. She looked happy, but something in the photo was off. The background of the image showed the same cabin where Miguel was now, but with a frightening detail. A shadowy figure was standing in the window. Miguel returned to the diary, eager to read the last page, but there was no text. Instead, the words seemed to have been scratched hard, leaving only deep grooves in the paper. He illuminated it better and realized that the marks formed a pattern, like a rudimentary map. Following his intuition, Miguel decided to investigate. He took the diary, left the cabin, and used the flashlight to follow the drawn instructions. Each step took him deeper into the forest, until he came to a clearing where the ground looked scorched. In the center, there was a small metal box that was partially buried. He dug it up and opened it, revealing something that took his breath away. Badges, all burned and twisted, with engraved names that he recognized. They belonged to the missing police officers. Suddenly, a whisper filled the air. "Now you know too much." The clearing was filled with dense fog, and Miguel felt that he was no longer alone. The diary seemed to vibrate in his hands, as if it were part of something larger, something he still didn't fully understand. Miguel felt his body freeze as the mist around him became almost solid, enveloping him like a heavy cloak. The voices whispered in unison, forming words he couldn't fully understand, but which seemed to carry a dark warning. With the diary clutched in his hands, he tried to move, but it was as if the ground was pulling him, the roots of the forest trying to trap him there forever. A last sound echoed, a deep, serious call, almost like a scream coming from the depths of the earth. And then everything went dark. When Miguel woke up, he was back in the cabin, the diary now completely blank. The only evidence of what had happened was the burning smell that still permeated his clothes and the marks on his arm, as if something had tried to grab him. He knew that the case would not end there, that the mystery of the police officer's disappearance and the secrets of the forest would continue to torment him, calling him back. And this is where the story reaches its most disturbing point. If you were shocked by Miguel's dark mysteries and want to know more about cases that defy logic and awaken your deepest fears, don't miss the next videos on this channel. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories full of suspense and horror. Leave a like, as it helps a lot to bring more content like this to you, and share in the comments. What would you do if you were in Miguel's shoes? Remember, every click can take you deeper into the unknown. Until the next story, if you have the courage to come back.